Thank you so much, Peter and Barbara, for those generous introductions and for making me feel so welcome here at Villanova. It's just the conclusion of my second year here, but when colleagues from other institutions ask me, how's it going, I say, I have so many spaces where I find intellectual conversation partners and places of welcome on campus. Not only the Theology and Religious Studies Department, but Mission and Ministry, the Humanities Department. I see we have Mark Schiffman here, and I'm looking forward to getting involved with Mike Moreland's center as well over at the law school. And this project that I'll share some of today, which now I'm still just developing, but has been developing very much here with the resources of Villanova. Last year, through the first year research program, I had a freshman student who helped with some background research for this project, Rama Goran, who did really wonderful work, some of which I'll cite here. Last summer, through the Veritas grant program, this research was further supported, so I really feel like this is specifically a project shaped by this Villanova experience. And last fall, I was able to, through this Villanova Political Theology project, bring together a number of scholars from across the country thinking about dignity from different sorts of perspectives often not represented in the conversation at a symposium called Dignity from the Margins, with anthropologists, scholars of literature, scholars of law, scholars of disability, scholars of colonialism, even an ethnographer who worked in North Korea to sort of share these different perspectives on what dignity means in these different contexts. But there I didn't get a chance to sort of try out some of my own work, which now I'm so grateful to Barbara for allowing me to do with you this afternoon. I'm not quite sure which I want to use here, but I'll do this. The language of dignity is a common... maybe yeah, maybe my eyes are not what they used to be. The language of dignity is a common denominator of the abolitionist movement, the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, and Black feminist organizing. In 2016, the Movement for Black Lives disseminated a platform that begins, quote, "Black humanity and dignity require Black political will and power." And Black Lives Matter associated preacher Osegefu Seku proclaimed, quote, "I understand the gospel to affirm Black dignity," unquote. Yet Black political struggles and in the background Black political theology are more often identified with themes of love and justice than with dignity. I hypothesize that if dignity takes center stage, forms of Black political struggle seemingly at odds with each other, Black nationalists and integrationists, Black feminists and Afrocentrists, Black writers and Black community organizers, in fact, appear to be animated by the same fundamental impulse. Before that hypothesis can be tested, whether dignity is this animating impulse, it's necessary to reflect on what dignity means in Black politics. This preliminary task is the one that I will take up this afternoon, first by reviewing the use of dignity in recent Black political organizing and its antecedents, then by positing basic characteristics of dignity in Black politics, and then by responding to two worries about my account of dignity, one about religion and one about respectability. Attending to dignity in Black politics allows for a dialogue with a large number of scholarly studies that have examined dignity over the last decade. Political theorists and intellectual historians have shown particular interest in the concept, developing a rapidly growing literature that stands at a distance from the steady stream of Christian theological reflections on dignity over the past half century. Attempts are underway to bridge this divide, with secular political theorists taking a deeper interest in the role dignity plays in religious thought, not only Christian theology, but also Jewish, Islamic, and other religious thought. I suspect frustration with the language of human rights partially motivates this turn to dignity. Over the last 2 decades, critics of human rights from the academy, from activist circles, and from global South political circles have pointed to ways in which human rights language and ideas are applied arbitrarily, often advancing the interests of the powerful rather than part of a consistent, systematic moral position. Moreover, the set of human rights seems to grow or shrink based on the interests of the day, with no agreement on how to determine what counts as a human right. Those theorists proposing a method for determining what counts have been charged with Western cultural imperialism, given the uncanny similarity between the set of rights their theories produce and the set of rights endorsed by Western political actors. Dignity promises to ground human rights in a clear, relatively uncontroversial claim, one that is endorsed broadly by many religions and traditions of the world, or so its proponents insist, namely that each human being has inherent incalculable worth. Accounts of dignity along these lines clearly resonate with Christian theological accounts of dignity, where incalculable worth comes from humans' creation in the image of God. But there are also long lines of secular and non-Christian reflection on dignity. Most famously, this includes the ethical theory of Kant, but an alternative lineage of dignity following from Hegel's thought is attracting increasing attention as well, for example, in the work of Axel Honneth. At the level of political and legal practice, the intellectual foundations of dignity remain bracketed as the concept enshrined in international and national legal norms. It's affirmed by the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the constitutions of 142 countries, is applied to specific circumstances in contexts ranging from bioethics to the laws of war to prisoners' rights. Recent attempts to provide expansive interdisciplinary overviews of the concept of dignity, including most notably the hefty edited volumes Understanding Human Dignity, published by Oxford University Press in 2013, and the Cambridge Handbook of Human Dignity, published by Cambridge in 2014, have sought to pluralize the scholarly conversation about dignity. Am I attempting yet to add yet another perspective on dignity from a different cultural context to that of African Americans? In one sense, the sources I discuss here do this, but my interest is more fundamental. I wish to make a stronger claim. Dignity, as it is found in Black political thought, is not an example of an important political philosophical or political theological concept applied to a specific context. Rather, dignity is often misunderstood in European Christian or post-Christian sources or their pluralizations. Put another way, making explicit my methodological commitments, examining dignity from the perspective of marginalized communities corrects errors that necessarily arise when a concept is examined from a perspective of privilege. So part one, circulation. According to the three women who coined the hashtag Black Lives Matter, dignity has always been at the heart of their movement. It was labor organizer Alicia Garza who first put the now famous three words into circulation in response to the acquittal of George Zimmerman for the killing of Trayvon Martin. And with the work of fellow organizers Patrice Cullors and Opal Tometi, a movement took shape, spreading on social media but grounded in local racial justice organizing collectives taking action in the streets. Amid multiple media narratives circulating around the origins of the movement, Garza told the story herself, her story of the movement, as she called it. After reflecting on the movement's origins, Garza asserts its core commitment. Quote, "When we say Black Lives Matter, we are talking about the ways in which Black people are deprived of our basic human rights and dignity." In the paragraph that follows, she lists some of what ails the Black community: poverty, incarceration, economic exploitation, immigration issues, particular harms faced by Blacks with disabilities and by Black queers and more. All of this, Garza asserts, is part of white supremacy, a structure of domination that Black Lives Matter aims to challenge. The ultimate goal is not to benefit Black people, but to benefit everyone. Quote, "When Black people get free, everybody gets free." What the movement calls for, Garza concludes, is, quote, "defense of our humanity," end quote. That is what will restore dignity to Blacks, and that is what will point us in the direction of a road without domination, a road where everybody is free, where everybody has dignity. Cullors, Garza's collaborator, similarly places dignity at the heart of her understanding of the movement. She reflects, quote, "I come at all my work from a deep philosophical place that asks, what does it take for humans to live in our full humanity and allow for others to live in their full dignity, unquote. Cullors founded a group called Dignity and Power Now, a grassroots organizing collective based in Los Angeles that focuses on empowering those incarcerated and their loved ones. Using tactics that include coalition building, art, research, and leadership development, Dignity and Power Now challenges mass incarceration by focusing locally, aware of both the effects of imprisonment on individuals and the broader systems, the prison industrial complex, of which the Los Angeles criminal justice system is a part. In her memoir, Cullors reflects on the origins of her organization's name. She remembers the arrest of her brother, and she remembers how, at the same time that mainstream America was ignoring the realities of police violence experienced by black communities like hers, Nelson Mandela had become an international icon of the struggle for justice. She recounts the words of Mandela's speech from his 1964 trial, quote, "Our fight is against real and not imaginary hardships, poverty, and lack of human dignity. The lack of human dignity experienced by Africans is a direct result of the policy of white supremacy," unquote. Domination deprives individuals of dignity, and the call for dignity motivates the struggle against domination. That struggle takes place through art, activism, research, and other activities. If we take now seriously and equivocally in Dignity and Power Now, it becomes clear how dignity can both be the goal and, in another sense, the achievement entailed by the practices of organizing themselves. Tometi is a Nigerian American who directs the Black Alliance for Just Immigration. She's the third co-founder. She, too, describes Black Lives Matter in terms of dignity. It aims, quote, "to protect and affirm the beauty and dignity of all black lives." When speaking out on immigration, she also uses the language of dignity, decrying current immigration laws because they have, quote, "disregarded the dignity and human rights of millions of immigrants," unquote, with a struggle for the dignity of immigrants, including black immigrants, connected to the struggle for dignity of blacks in Africa and black Americans. Tometi describes herself as a, quote, "believer and practitioner of liberation theology," unquote, and she links her commitment to dignity to her faith commitment. "We are all called," she asserts, quote, "to our highest, most dignified selves." Further, quote, "one's spiritual practice and aspirations for dignity and self-actualization are what a rich faith life is about," unquote. Note here how Tometi is not identifying faith with a commitment to dignity, for example, by saying that belief in God allows her to recognize the inherent worth and dignity of every human being. Rather, dignity appears in gradations, and becoming more dignified, which is self-actualization in her terminology, is something we can achieve through faith life. Tometi goes on to assert that faith and justice are inextricably intertwined. A rich faith life means a life committed to the struggle for social justice. While three women started the Black Lives Matter movement, it quickly took on a life of its own as individuals connected via social media or organizing meetings, creating new formations and energizing existing grassroots networks. With media narratives defining the movement and limiting it, leaders decided to work together on a platform that could spell out the details, the shared values of the movement participants and injustices that the movement, in all its manifestations, targeted, right? A platform to say this is what the movement is about. Through a year-long consultative process, creating dialogues between local grassroots racial justice groups, the Movement for Black Lives platform began to take shape. This document includes a preamble and 6 demands, with each demand detailing a problem and solutions at the national and local level, together with further resources and information about groups organizing around the demand. The platform's preamble describes the world desired by the movement. Quote, "a world in which the full humanity and dignity of all people is recognized," unquote. To achieve this, quote, "requires black political will and power." Again, there is a certain equivocation here. In one sense, dignity is a desired end state, likely never to be realized. In another sense, the more black organizing there is, the more black dignity. In other words, it seems as though there is an eschatological sense of dignity at work, present in the world of full humanity, in Christian terms, when the dead will rise, and also a worldly sense of dignity at work, where dignity is identified with struggle. In the demands themselves, a third sense of dignity is at work. This is dignity achieved when specific practices of domination end, not dignity achieved at the eschaton, and not dignity entailed by struggle. To take three examples, the movement opposes the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade agreement so as to advance the dignity of black workers. It supports a constitutional right to education in order to advance the dignity of students. And it opposes the shackling of women during pregnancy and childbirth to advance women's dignity. Many intellectual and organizing streams flow into the current movement for racial justice in the United States, and young organizers have been particularly effective at discerning which practices and ideas of earlier generations are most important to embrace. As Collard's citation of Mandela on dignity suggests, organizers are well aware that dignity has long been a part of the vocabulary of black politics. In fact, it is astonishing just how ubiquitous it is. Even militantly secularized youths rallying around the slogan Black Power, who would discard as ineffectual and old-fashioned many elements of civil rights movement Christianity, continued to talk about dignity. Even those black feminists who turned toward the language of love and self-care embraced the language of dignity. From poets to novelists to orators to elected politicians, dignity was widely discussed, though this has rarely been reflected on by political theorists. I don't have time here to carry out an exhaustive survey and analysis of the concept of dignity in black politics, but I'll offer a few examples. Langston Hughes, the poet, develops the concept of dignity in two quite different contexts. In one poem from the 1930s about the ordeal of the Scottsboro boys, Hughes writes of how, quote, a young black boy will die, yet, quote, judges in high places still preserve their dignity, unquote. This suggests a sort of hollow dignity, dignity that is not dignity at all, the dignity supposed to attach to a judge that is given the lie when we see that judge as a child killer. In a poem titled Harlem Dance Hall, first published in 1947, Hughes describes the transformation of the eponymous building when music starts. Quote, suddenly the earth was there, and flowers, trees, and air. The hall, quote, had no dignity before, the poem begins, and it ends the same way. The hall had no dignity before. But music gives it life, and with that dignity. In contrast to the hollow dignity of the judge, a band creates rich, thick dignity, dignity that includes individuals, but is not reducible to the sum of individuals. The concept of dignity was deeply baked into the vocabulary of Martin Luther King Jr., famously. Indeed, in the collection of his key writings, the big one, the word dignity appears more than 100 times, and it occurs more than 30 times in King's account of the Montgomery bus boycott. Sometimes King uses dignity to suggest nobility, the dignity of courtesy titles, for example. But more often, dignity contrasts with life subject to domination. Quote, it is ultimately more honorable to walk the streets in dignity than to ride the buses in humiliation, unquote. Both senses of dignity touch on honor, but in the second sense, honor is achieved under the shadow of segregation. Moreover, in the case of the bus boycotters, dignity was not only connected to personal honor, it was also connected to collective struggle. Walking the streets gave the boycotters dignity, deserved honor, because in this act, they were challenging a system of domination. After the Montgomery protest had continued for 11 months with its ups and downs, Dignity told assembled protesters, quote, I want you to know that this struggle has not been in vain, he continued. If it has done any one thing in this community, it has given us a new sense of dignity and destiny. And I think that in itself is a victory for freedom and a victory for the cause of justice, unquote. Dignity is achieved through struggle, King is asserting, regardless of whether particular policies are changed, regardless of whether complete dignity beyond domination is achieved. Dignity, in a meaningful sense, is found in a community working together to challenge white supremacy, to challenge domination. Marcus Garvey frequently used the term dignity in the sense associated with nobility, but occasionally he used it in more expansive senses as well. Near the end of his life, in Theological Reflections, Garvey exhorts his audience to be sure they are clean before they approach God, not in bodies but in minds. Quote, "Your thoughts are the things that make you look like God. It is our soul, our intelligence, that is in his likeness. Therefore," quote, "we must live up to the dignity and honor of his intelligence by possessing our souls and using our minds," unquote. Regardless of how wealthy or healthy someone is, she or he has the potential to participate in the dignity of God by using a mind creatively. Garvey considers his own life as exemplary, recalling how he was born black in a white-dominated world in Jamaica, but he did not let himself be constrained by the ways of the world. Quote, "I looked at the system that man fixed up for me, and I said, it did not suit me," unquote. This is dignity, realizing that systems of domination constrain our humanity, stamp out the image of God, and then creatively rebelling. In later black nationalist writings, dignity would continue to play an important role, for example, with Malcolm X repeatedly naming human dignity as the goal of his struggle, and noting how collaboration with structures of domination through, for example, the state welfare system is, quote, "robbing us of our dignity," unquote. A few years later, Stokely Carmichael, another sort of Black Power era leader, would repeatedly invoke the concept of dignity, for example, calling on black nationalists to, quote, "make alliances with people who are trying to rebuild their culture, trying to rebuild their history, trying to rebuild their dignity, with people who are fighting for their humanity." The concept of dignity is found in the classics of black feminism, from Ida B. Wells to Anna Julia Cooper, as well as in the modern classics from Audre Lorde to Angela Davis to Alice Walker. Bell Hooks is particularly instructive because she uses dignity not only to mark opposition to white supremacy, but also to look at the differential impact of domination across gender lines. Black women, unlike black men, were made to feel that when survival was a crucial issue, personal dignity should be sacrificed, unquote. In other words, Hooks suggests a way in which challenging domination is a privilege that not everyone in dominated communities can afford. Sexual and racial domination intersect, with the result that the possibility of dignity is taken away from black women. Quote, "Black women were told that we should find our dignity not in liberation from sexist oppression, but in how well we could adjust, adapt, and cope," unquote. Life bent into conformity with systems of domination, Hooks suggests, is not dignity at all. Practice oriented toward liberation is where dignity is to be found. It is, in a quite different sort of political arena, Michelle Obama repeatedly invokes dignity in her speeches and is described as embodying dignity. Quote, "America's greatness comes from recognizing the innate dignity and worth of all our people," unquote, she told a New Hampshire audience on the campaign trail for Hillary Clinton. "Having a president who does not respect the dignity of women cannot make America great," in Obama's reading. While the same word is used by Obama as it is by Hooks and by many black feminists, in the realm of electoral politics, dignity is reduced to a status disconnected from a practice of liberation. Right? So I like Hooks. I'm more ambivalent about Michelle Obama. So there's a line there. Part 2, characteristics. The standard history of dignity told by political theorists is based around a shift from one meaning of dignity before modernity to another meaning of dignity in modernity, with the earlier meaning persisting in a subordinate role in ordinary speech today. Before modernity, dignity suggested the honor and privileges associated with high rank or office. Dignity in this sense was attributed to kings and nobles, church officials, and government officials. Dignity was an attribute of, as the word suggests, dignitaries. Among kings, all of the same rank, there is equality, and so among dukes, among bishops, and among judges. According to Jeremy Waldron, in the late 18th century, a transvaluation of values occurs. Now it is ordinary people, rather than classes of elites, who have dignity, while the dignity previously ascribed to elites comes to be seen as, quote, superficial or bogus. Ordinary people all share in the same rank, all share in humanity, and so all share in a basic type of equality. Dignity now, in modernity, is ascribed to each person by virtue of his or her humanity. We still talk of dignitaries and about politicians or other elites sullying the dignity of their office. We've talked about that quite a bit in the last year and a half or so. But in political and legal discourse, dignity refers to the inherent worth of each human being. Dignity is democratized on this standard account. In contrast, the concept of dignity found in black political thought, at its best, is neither attributed to classes of individuals because of their rank, nor is it ascribed to all individuals by virtue of their humanity. Dignity, in its most essential sense, is ascribed to those who struggle against domination. Those who dominate or who participate in systems of domination do not have dignity, on this view. Those who are entirely dominated to the point that all of their speech and actions are determined by the dynamics of domination also do not have dignity. But those who are subjected to domination and challenge that domination in whatever way, from passive resistance to active political organizing to aesthetic imagining, those individuals are properly described as having dignity. In the US racial landscape simplified to black and white, this means those whites who ignore their privilege and don't attend to questions of racial justice might lack dignity. Those blacks who follow the scripts given to them by white supremacy also lack dignity. But all, black or white, who challenge white supremacy in whatever form have dignity. Obviously, these are ideal types considered in laboratory conditions. In the real world, all people experience domination in some aspects of their lives and participate in systems of domination in other aspects of their lives. Nevertheless, ideal types illuminate, inviting us to consider a third sense of dignity, this black sense of dignity, that relates neither to nobility nor to shared humanity. When white supremacy is nearly all-powerful and omnipresent, imagine the Jim Crow South, challenges to this form of domination will not look like community organizing meetings, advertising, come here to challenge white supremacy. In a system meant to humiliate individuals and destroy sociality, resistance takes the form of any commitment to sociality, including family, religious community, dance, even funeral processions, as well as refusals to be humiliated, including pride, holding one's head up, literary and aesthetic production, even humor. Thus, dignity is properly ascribed to black artists and singers, black religious practitioners, black dancers, and ordinary black men and women who subtly commit to resisting white supremacy. Not every black dancer or artist, joker or preacher counts as having dignity. Recognizing dignity requires discernment. Is the aesthetic production or humor or sermon or whatever else participating in or challenging the logics of domination? If the powers that be become accustomed to a particular, say, black man who holds his head high, refusing humiliation, and then decide to make use of him as a liaison with the rest of the black community to keep that community in check, would this particular black man still be described as having dignity? These complexities require practical wisdom and discussion rather than application of clear rules to classes of individuals. Holding your head up high, looking others in the eye, when others around you are bowing their heads and averting their eyes, this looks like nobility. This is also the image that comes from Philip Pettit's account of civic republicanism for those political theory aficionados. The king or princess or bishop also carries himself or herself in these ways, in contrast to those individuals nearby who are not dignitaries. This dynamic occurs under the shadow of white supremacy in African America, where nobility and subtle resistance become identified, Black dignity. Black dignity also includes the sense in which everyone, by virtue of our shared humanity, has dignity, resonating with the modern European concept of dignity. If each of us is dominated in some ways, and everyone who is dominated resists in some ways, each of us has a degree of dignity. It is by virtue of our shared humanity that we all always, to some degree, resist being dominated. And it is also by virtue of our shared humanity that we are in some way dominated. Right? The dynamics of domination are all pervasive and unavoidable, whether they be around gender, race, class, disability, nationality, or some other ideology. In Christian terms, we live in a fallen world. In equally Christian terms, we all have the capacity to accept redemption. In a world of domination, we all have the capacity and desire, latent or activated, to challenge domination. Leftist political theorists sometimes label this realizing our humanity. The more we struggle, the more human we become. In the concept of dignity I'm outlining, dignity is not ascribed because of a status, but because of a performance. You have dignity because of something you do rather than because of who you are. Certainly, repeated performances suggest something about the character of the performer, leading to a person being ascribed with dignity independent of a specific performance, but the performances remain essential. What performance of dignity looks like can vary widely. Systems of domination are deep and insidious, dictating what can be said and done, but also what can be felt, and even habits of thought. So challenges to domination can take place in many domains by many means. Performances of dignity can involve performance in the narrow sense, such as theater, music, or oratory, but also in the broader sense of writing, philosophizing, praying, hesitating, and, of course, organizing. That Black dignity is to be found in performance raises the worry that Black dignity merely describes a social dynamic with no normative edge, and so lacks what political and legal practitioners find so valuable about the concept of dignity today. Of course, in the tradition of Black political thought, there are clearly normative claims made for dignity. We demand dignity as a claim. Right? In my account, such claims are performative. A woman achieves dignity by saying out loud, in the right sort of circumstances, that she demands dignity. But this would seem to reduce the normative to the descriptive, and it does not seem to take the content of political speech seriously enough. Those struggling against domination seem to have a particular goal in mind, a world where domination is no more, where struggle is no longer necessary. In that world, everyone can hold their head up high and look everyone else in the eye. This strikes me as an eschatological scene, much like those evoked when we are invited to imagine a world of peace, freedom, harmony, love, justice, or equality. Whenever we take these slogans as more than rhetoric, when we try to explicate their content and turn it into a plan for action in this world, things go wrong. Political theorists recognizing this have finally become suspicious of ideal theory. Right? In contrast, at the eschaton, there will be a world of dignity in both the sense of rank and the sense of inherent worth. Without domination, all will hold their heads high. The explications of slogans invoking the eschaton that are helpful and that do pack a normative punch focus on the negative. Civic Republicans like Philip Pettit explicate freedom as non-domination. Some theorists have urged a focus on injustices rather than on theorizing justice. And I've argued elsewhere that the language of love that Martin Luther King so famously deploys is best understood as a criticism of what love is not. The rhetorical power of such language, including the demand for dignity, certainly motivates, but it also contains a normative claim. Systems of domination are illicit and ought to be challenged. Put another way, performances of dignity, contain implicit within them the call for others to join in. Black dignity is contagious, and it catalyzes community organizing against domination. When dignity is invoked in black political practice, however, it seems to have a much more worldly focus. For example, consider the assertion segregated lunch counters are an insult to our dignity. As a performance, dignity is always situated within a specific context. What amounts to a performance of dignity in one context will have nothing to do with dignity in another context. Rather than taking the anti-segregation activists' rallying cry as expressing an eternal truth about dignity, that it implies segregation is always wrong, I take the slogan as pointing to a particular manifestation of a specific system of domination. In other words, what segregated lunch counters are an insult to our dignity means is that segregated lunch counters are part of a system of domination that we must oppose. The claim also conjures a world without domination, a world redeemed that motivates action in the present. Segregation is a mark of the distance between that world and our world, and opposing segregation indicates our commitment to that other world. Through the performance of that commitment in rhetoric and action, we see dignity as it appears in this world, not in some pure form imagined in a world redeemed, but in its worldly form as opposition to domination. This brings us to the question of religion, and specifically political theology. The democratized account of dignity that circulates in modernity is often presented as a secularized theological concept. In Christian thought, humans are created in the image of God, guaranteeing our inherent worth. With secularization, on this view, this image is given specific content, legible outside of a religious context. For example, it is said that possessing the capacity to reason is the way that humans image God. In this view, the pre-modern account of dignity as rank was misaligned with Christianity, and it developed independent of Christian reflections on the image of God. The transvaluation of dignity that Waldron identified, that took place with the start of modernity, brought dignity into alignment with Christianity on this view, culminating in near coincidence of Catholic accounts of dignity and accounts of dignity in the nascent international legal regime during the mid-20th century. This story is the story that's told is certainly more complicated, with the pre-modern view having its own political theology, with the king's dignity guaranteed by his association with the divine, whereas the modern concept of dignity corresponds to a more incarnational theology. But is there any way, so setting those complications aside, is there any way of understanding black dignity that suggests a relationship to Christian theology? Right? Is this third concept of dignity, apart from the pre-modern and the modern in that story, aligned in some ways with Christian theology? Many of the black political leaders who have used the language of dignity also participated in or were formed in Christian communities. If dignity means performances that challenge domination, and the end of domination can only be envisioned eschatologically, dignity would have a significant theological resonance. Further, if domination means idolatry, means the machinations of the wealthy and powerful that obscure our perception and ultimately separate us from each other and from the divine, then challenging domination means refusing the ways of the world, refusing to let the world fully determine who one is. What remains, marked by that refusal, indicating something wholly other, is what Christians express as the image of God. Note the consequences of this distinctive political theological configuration. The modern European account of dignity would have us attend to the dignity of an orphan or leper or impoverished woman, noticing the image of God in her and responding with personal charity or by advocating for social structures that offer assistance. From this third perspective, the perspective of black dignity, that I'm calling of black dignity, the individual in need should not grab and hold our attention. The individual in need, right, should not grab and hold our attention. Domination in all its varieties so pervades the world and distorts our perception that any instinct to respond to a particular suffering individual is likely to do more harm than good. Encountering a particular suffering individual is an occasion to notice systems of domination and, as our awareness of domination sharpens, to challenge them more effectively, ideally together with that suffering individual who prompted our reflection. struggling together against domination, we both perform dignity. So part 3, the last part 2, complications. The historical narrative about dignity's democratization in modernity has come under scrutiny recently by historian Samuel Moyn. He claims that dignity simply was not a relevant concept in the practice of politics until the mid-20th century. At that point, the leadership of the Catholic Church began talking about dignity. For example, in Pope Pius XII's 1942 Christmas message that extolled dignity throughout and listed dignity of the human person as the first aspect of a well-ordered society. This is an innovation on Moyn's view. And the concept began making its way into Western European constitutions, flowing from this sort of Catholic rediscovery. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, begins, quote, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is a foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world, and goes on to begin Article 1, quote, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Unquote. On Moyn's account, such language would have been unthinkable 2 decades earlier, and even in the 2 decades following the Declaration's adoption, the language of human rights and dignity was slow to spread. Right? It wasn't until the 70s it actually starts moving around. There was a very specific set of factors that led to dignity's prominence in the 1940s, first in Catholicism, right, having to deal with European Catholics' political influence through Christian democratic political parties. In the 1930s, the Church had been speaking of the dignity of workers and of sacraments, rarely of individuals. But moderate French Catholics developed a language of human dignity to navigate between the scylla of secular liberalism and the Charybdis of totalitarian-friendly Catholic corporatists. After the war, these moderate Catholics captured elite political discourse because of how social capital sort of flowed. In Moyn's view, talk of human dignity today originates in this French Catholic milieu. If Moyn's account is correct, it would call into question dignity's status as a common denominator of black political movements, from Frederick Douglass to Black Lives Matter. At the very least, it would introduce a discontinuity between black dignity before European influence in the mid-20th century and black dignity after. To explore this possibility, Villanova sophomore Rama Goran and I did some archival research, looking through an electronic database of African-American newspapers that covered most of the 20th century for articles that used the word dignity. So we did a keyword search for the word dignity in this newspaper database that the Villanova Library happily purchased a subscription to, another way that Villanova resources have supported this. We found that the term was used in African-American contexts both before and after the shift that Moyn identifies. But the connotations of the term do indeed change. 1906 item in the Afro-American refers to clerical dignity, associating it with solemnity. In 1908, the Afro-American, the same newspaper, reprinted a 2-paragraph item from the white-oriented Ladies' Home Journal entitled Rival Dignities. It wittily contrasts English dignity, associated with descent from an ancestor ennobled by a king, and American dignity, associated with descent from an ancestor killed by an Indian. Here, dignity associated with the honors of nobility is mocked. In a sense, dignity is democratized in the American context. Right? Although the figure of the Indian limits the democratization to white Americans, black readers must certainly have appreciated that the thrust of the item was to mock any restriction of dignity to a special class of people. A feisty unsigned column in the Chicago Defender, published in 1911 under the title There is Dignity in All Labor, complains that a certain local minister described washing and ironing as beneath his wife, as beneath the pastor's wife, or the priest's. Well, I guess this is a specifically Protestant problem. The Cleveland Call and Post reports that an African-American social club exists in that city known as, there's an African-American social club known as Dignities in Cleveland that held a high-class dance, suggesting that the name implies nobility or high rank. In 1948, just as the UN was enshrining dignity in international law, the Afro-American praised City College of New York for, quote, upholding human dignity, unquote, by removing an employee who insisted on segregated dormitories following student protests. By the mid-1950s and following, dignity was widely used in commentaries on racial justice struggles. If we look even earlier to the writings of Frederick Douglass, we find many instances of dignity associated with high rank or aristocracy. In the Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, his third and longest autobiography, published in 1881, we find the author describing the, quote, great dignity and grandeur, unquote, of the colonel's home, quote, a dignity and grandeur about the Chief Justice, and a Commodore who, quote, departed himself with much dignity toward us all, unquote, for example. There are also several uses of dignity in relation to women, suggesting that women hold a certain nobility-like position, a usage also found in the newspaper archive, including the image of well-dressed women representing the Dignities dance club. But most intriguing are the instances when Douglass uses dignity in a way that pushes against the limits of rank or aristocracy. Douglass notes that Americans, quote, after contempt for the castes and aristocracies of the old world, so Americans affect contempt for the castes and aristocracies of the old world and laugh at their assumptions, yet the worth and dignity of manhood is not consistently respected in the United States because of the treatment of blacks. Right? Further retelling the story of his definitive fight with the slave breaker Covey, Douglass first notes, rather apologetically, that the battle and his narration was undignified. Yet the struggle was essential to recount, Douglass tells us, because it marks the turning point in his life, allowing him to dream anew of freedom. It, quote, revived a sense of my own manhood, unquote. Before, Douglass suffered from crushed self-respect. Now he was confident and determined, all because of the physical struggle. Douglass concludes, quote, a man without force is without the essential dignity of humanity, unquote. In short, in African-American writing, we find the language of dignity used the way it is used in the ambient culture to denote high rank or, in the second half of the 20th century, inherent worth. But we also find a third concept of dignity, black dignity, not accounted for by Moyne, not traceable to 1930s France. Black dignity both admires and mocks the pretenses of American dignity to universality, affirming instead dignity identified with what Douglass calls force, with struggle against domination, embodied in a slave breaker or manifested in a system of white supremacy. A final worry about dignity comes from a quite different direction. One component of the sophisticated political project advanced by young black activists today is an attack on respectability politics. By this, they mean black politicians and activists who would offer a certain sort of performance to white audiences in order to be perceived as respectable, so worthy of white attention. Sometimes the dynamics of respectability are internalized in the black community itself, with the black leaders receiving support from the black community because the leader appears respectable. For example, in the way she dresses or speaks or acts. Activists worry that not only are such performances unseemly, they also compromise the content and style of black political demands for an uncertain and often negligible payoff. Put another way, playing respectability politics appears to activists to solicit the respect of whites or of the white gaze at the cost of black self-respect or black dignity. On the other hand, respectability and dignity seem troublingly close to each other. Are not the words respectable and dignified used almost synonymously? Are not some of the performances of dignity discussed above, for example in the Dignities Dance Hall, really attempts to garner respect from whites, either directly or through internalized white gaze? This worry becomes particularly acute where the language of dignity is applied to women, sometimes by women. And Anna Julia Cooper is an ambivalent example of this, where she speaks of dignity where it seems like it might be a sort of self-assertion. On the other hand, it might also be, this sort of negative sense of respectability or unseemly sense of respectability. The historian and feminist critic Brittany Cooper, and Twitter personality Brittany Cooper, has recently argued that Anna Julia Cooper and other early black feminists advance positions, quote, beyond respectability, She wrote a book called Beyond Respectability. And the thing that you get when you go beyond respectability on her view is toward dignity. As she writes, quote, "The call for dignity and the call for respectability are not the same, though they are frequently conflated. Demands for dignity are demands for a fundamental recognition of one's inherent humanity. Demands for respectability assume that unassailable social propriety will prove one's dignity. Dignity, unlike respectability, is not socially contingent," unquote. Here, Cooper, the critic, leans on the modern European definition of dignity, indicating inherent worth. If we appeal to the black concept of dignity, what I'm calling the black concept of dignity, in contrast, dignity is understood as a performance located within a social context. Does that dissolve the difference between dignity and respectability? Just the opposite. The performance of respectability aims at creating the appearance of inherent worth. The performance of black dignity aims at challenging domination, which in effect means challenging rather than replicating the appearance of inherent worth ascribed only to some. As we've seen, in conclusion, such challenges can take a variety of forms. Can they include the, quote, quiet, undisputed dignity of my womanhood that Anna Julia Cooper writes about? As with all performances of dignity, the audience is called to judge. There may be good reasons on both sides, given the complexities of the cultural setting. If we recall how that line was received, Cooper's line, our judgment may be swayed. When and Where I Enter, right, quoting from Cooper, became the title of a feminist history of black American women. In The Quiet, Undisputed Dignity of My Womanhood became the title of another. Elsewhere, Anna Julia Cooper writes of education for blacks in the post-emancipation South. She writes elegantly about the sacrifices black women took upon themselves in order to afford to send their children to school. Quote, "The work of these schools has been like the little leaven hid in the measure of meal, diffusing a contagious longing for higher living and purer thinking, inspiring woman herself with a new sense of dignity in the eternal purposes of nature." For Cooper, dignity does not come about through violent physical struggle as it does for Douglas, but it comes about through struggle nonetheless, right? Through struggle to provide education. If we understand struggle as a challenge to forms of domination, then the practice of education that Cooper describes here, the longing for higher living and purer thinking that is cultivated by schools, most certainly runs against the machinery of domination that would quash all such desires. And here Cooper returns us to the political theology of dignity. The forces of domination would keep black women and their children tethered to the world, but refusing the ways of the world, refusing white supremacy, and desiring something more elevates us to participate in the eternal. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for that question and for the opportunity. Yeah, I guess I get lost in the complexity sometimes, and I'm not always I get the points across the most clearly. So I appreciate the opportunity to just restate a little bit. Right. I mean, I think you're exactly right that I'm trying to think. I'm using this tradition of African American politics, not to say that. In order to figure out what dignity really is, right? And to say that dignity might have been misunderstood, right? There might have been tendencies in this sort of broader discussion about dignity to go astray in this way or go astray in this way. But when we attend to marginalized voices, we can right ourselves, right? And one marginalized voice that we can listen to is African American political organizing in the U.S. context. And so to listen carefully to those voices is important. Racial domination is one form of domination. It just provides an example of this different sorts of domination. And the form of dignity that I'm finding there, or that I'm trying to explicate from these sources, is one that sees, that, as you're saying, identifies dignity with a struggle against domination. And as you're pointing out, the term struggle can imply the Frederick Douglass version of struggle, right? Fighting Covey, in the barn or whatever, rolling around, right? Which I don't want to say is the only way to think about struggle, or should be the privileged side of thinking about struggle, right? So ending with Anna Julia Cooper, right, who also is talking about dignity, and also I want to say is talking about dignity and struggle, right? Dignity and struggle against domination. By ending with her, I want to hold up an alternative way of thinking about struggle, right? So struggle for her is initiating marginalized communities into the life of the mind, right? Bringing working black men and women into the world of great books, and through that, right, that has the effect of challenging domination, right? So I want to include this whole repertoire, from the Langston Hughes talking about music and dance to the very direct confrontation with Douglass, to the very subtle sort of confrontation with Cooper. I want that whole repertoire to be open to sites of dignity in this sense that I'm talking about. Does that?
Yes. Yes.
Mm. Yes.
My question is there a sort of dialogue between those two discourses that you sketched on dignity, that is the human rightist discourse on dignity, that states that dignity is a status, and the other one that states that dignity is the performance of someone who struggles against domination? That asks the question because in the post-Second World War world order, the states, the democratic, liberal, parliamentary, and so on states of the free world, themselves they speak the language of human rights, while very obviously they are the ones who violate the same human rights of the people who stand against them. So I would be curious if there is a criticism, at least on the part of the second discourse that you sketched against the human rights discourse on dignity.
So thank you for the question, and I'll say some things, and you can see if I'm addressing it. Right. So these 147 countries that have dignity in their constitution, right? Many of them do many naughty things, things that we wouldn't want countries to be doing, or leaders of countries. So I mean, it seems like this language of dignity as a status that circulates after the Second World War isn't particularly effective in doing what it is ostensibly supposed to do. And I mean, this is perhaps motivating from a theological perspective, or in conversation with theologians, a worry about secularism, right? That theologians who it may be the case that this post-Second World War sort of agreement about what dignity is, had this, is now widely accepted in secular political life, and came from a specifically Catholic context. But I think Catholic people reflecting on dignity should worry, then, that when Catholics are talking about dignity, they don't just adopt now, the secularized political language of dignity that allows for 147 countries to be happy with it and then to do naughty things, right? So I mean, I think that the challenge, right, is given that suspicion, right, how can we recover a different concept of dignity that might have the same word and might have shared relatives, right, as the one that's circulating in the international legal regime these days, but that it is more fundamentally oriented toward justice, right, and so. I mean, it strikes me that the focus on status and the various ways that dignity gets explicated in that legal regime, are troubled, and so it's a time to look for ways to sort of reorient the conversation. I feel like I said a lot of things that were just restating your question rather than answering it, but yeah.
So this is less directly about the concept of dignity, but more about racial justice and Black Lives Matter, which is in both I was reading an article earlier about Deontay Yarbo. Are you familiar? Okay, so he was shot 13 days ago in Barstow while sitting in a car that was idling in a Walmart parking lot. It's suspicious to do that. And I'm curious as to what you think and admittedly it could just be an absence of my own knowledge from not being engaged with the church, but what do you think the responsibility is of, outside of black churches, but the evangelical movement that is largely associated with the right in this country, or the Catholic Church, or all of the Protestant churches, as far as addressing the issue of racial injustice, specifically in the context of police brutality and the murder of black people?
Thanks. No, that's a great and really pressing question, right? How can religious communities today, speak responsibly to the racial justice challenges of the day, which are really racial justice challenges that have been of many days, but that are capturing media attention today or these days. One of the things I notice is that on the one hand, there's a narrative about racial justice activists on the ground no longer caring about Christianity. Right? There's an article in The Atlantic about the unchurched movement or something like that, saying that Black Lives Matter activists are different from civil rights movement activists because they don't. The Black Lives Matter activists, are detached from institutionalized religion. On the other hand, it seems like there's a whole lot of spirituality, a whole lot of religious language that circulates in racial justice organizing, right? Whether it's language of love or dignity or spirit or ways of talking about justice. That language seems like it's everywhere, and it's because it's. I think there's a sort of complicated relationship that also has to do with secularism here, right? There's a sort of desire to disclaim any connection with Christianity, and yet still having been formed by, this sort of post-Christian culture. So the vocabulary coming from Christianity, but without any sort of accountability to Christian traditions. So it seems important for scholars of religion and religious denominations and communities to listen carefully, right? To hear the languages, and particularly Christian languages, circulating in racial justice movements, and to offer in response, that same language, but with the depths of the religious traditions that we have access to, right? At a Catholic institution, or at evangelical institutions, or at other at Protestant institutions, right? The depths of tradition can speak back that secularized religious language in a way that deepens it and orients it toward justice, right? And away from pragmatism, away from self-interest. I think in general, there's a challenge with activist movements that there's excitement in the moment, but how is that sustained, and how is it oriented, right? How do you know where to move next, which incident to focus your attention on? And that's another thing that religious communities can offer, right? The sense of developing the virtue of faith, right? A sort of commitment that persists despite hardship, right? Animated by this sort of future vision, a broader vision, and offering skills for discernment. I think those connections are really essential to make, and religious traditions have the resources to make them and to be in dialogue.
Vincent, thank you so much. This was an extraordinary talk, one I think that many of us would want to ponder over the written word. You speak like a New Yorker, don't you? very rapid.
Okay.
And I also am really applaud your inclusion of students in your research. That students are very wonderful. You use the word redemption at least twice throughout, and I piqued an interest in that the struggle against domination and a world without discrimination is a redeemed world. We claim in Christianity that we live in a redeemed world. And I was thinking
Yes, yeah. So this sounds like a question that might be better for my systematics colleagues who and a little bit above my pay grade in terms of getting the redemption right as a sort of theological category and if sort of figuring out how it fits into a larger vision. But I mean, certainly I agree that having a foretaste of the eschaton in the present is essential part of the Christian tradition. I think I still, in addition to, I should consult with some of my systematics colleagues, but I'm still thinking myself and sort of figuring out, how, well, first, whether the language of struggle is a right language. I mean, I think it can be, as Gabor's question was pointing out, or as someone's question was pointing out, it can be misleading. But whether this sort of orientation against domination, how does that fit? How does that participate in this? Redeemed world. I mean, if these two things look very different, right? If the intuition is to say that struggle against domination, how do you see in that, right? What are the characteristics of that are offering this sort of foretaste?
Yeah, I see some of the dilemma in the sense of even our conception of a redeemed world has social construction. And how to get beyond that to another appreciation.
I'm much more comfortable in the negative theological idiom because of exactly this sort of question. Yes, Mark.
So I'm kind of improvising here, but trying to piece together some of the many interesting things that I heard you say, and in relation to Barbara's question as well. One of the things that struck me most about the account that you're giving of Black dignity and this sense of dignity, right, is that when there's in a way the emphasis on resistance is very modern, right, and a kind of first reaction, you might even say almost Lockean, right, the sort of self-assertion as the way in which rights replaces virtue as the focus of dignity, right? But in that Lockean version, it's very individualistic, right? And one of the really compelling things I thought that you're offering in this account is that because there's a togetherness of being dominated, right, and needing to resist that domination, that practices of community, practices of family, practices of togetherness constitute a form of resistance that are not individualistic, right? And it seems to me that one of the aspects of the always already redeemed character reality is the sacramental one in the Catholic tradition, right? So that, the Eucharist, for example, right, is the redemption, but precisely in the form of the crucified suffering of Christ, right? And that's the togetherness of the church focused in that sacramentality, right? So it seems to me that there's a really if you start pushing it in the theological direction, you're emphasizing, you can really see the way in which there's a deep resonance, a deep affinity of this notion of what it means to have a dignity that's oriented towards, and I like your formulation of its sort of negative eschatological sensibility, but with this sense of a continually achieved communion in that orientation.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's fantastic, Mark. That's really, really helpful. And I really
just one fine point on that. One of the things that I think is great about that too is that it doesn't put commitment and patience at odds with each other, but in fact, gives them a way of coexisting in the sense of what the dignity of the struggle is, how it's embodied.
Thanks. No, that's really great, and I have a lot to think about and to work with there as I'm refining this project. And I mean, I think naming that intuition that struggle is a modern, part of the sort of modern self-assertion, it seems really important, and then sort of opening that up, right? I mean, what does Augustine do if not struggle, right? Struggle, against himself and against the sort of powers of the world, right? If the ways of the world are, radically amiss, right? Then, struggle against the ways of the world in all sorts of different forms, particularly in, the Christian tradition, right? Is, a big thing, right? Even if it's labeled different things, right? If it's struggle against the culture of death, if it's struggle against, Rome, if it's a struggle against one's own, perverse desires or so. I mean, distorted desires. That's that all seems. Thinking about how all of those are connected and how dignity can sort of the sort of dignity that I'm explicating from the Black political tradition, fits with that larger narrative seems really, really helpful. And then the patient stuff, I just have to think more about that. Sounds great, though. Yeah. Oh, and the Eucharist, yeah. It's always good to end with the Eucharist bringing everyone together.